So, welcome to part two of our three-part series of how the relationship between the English colonies here in America and the mother country of England or Great Britain fell apart over a 13-year period. In this one, we're going to see England really try to force Americans to obey. It's not about doing the right thing for England at this stage. It's more about trying to force what we call compliance, making sure that the people here in America obeyed them, even if their orders and their laws and their decisions were not reasonable or violated their rights and became abusive. So when we were last talking, we left King George, and he wasn't very happy about how things were going. And the things he wasn't happy about was the disrespect that he and Parliament were getting from Americans. Smuggling was the first step. When the Sugar Act was passed, it wasn't that big a deal. Americans really had no reason to hate that, but they smuggled and avoided the tax and broke the law, and King George was upset about that. And then with the Stamp Act, he didn't like the boycott because it cost him money that was set up by the Daughters of Liberty, and the Sons of Liberty were using violence as well, which he certainly couldn't stomach or abide. He absolutely had to do something about this. Now, on the American side, the Americans' complaint was a valid one. Americans were paying a direct tax, the Stamp Act, and they had no voice in representation in England's Parliament, their lawmaking Congress over in England. England believed that since everyone was British, people in America, people in England, everyone was British, and that all of Parliament was British, they felt that meant Americans were represented. But Americans' claim was, we're 3,000 miles away, we're across an ocean, things are different here, and we need people to speak for us who are actually living with us. And it's a valid criticism, and it's something that England should have probably granted the Americans. But instead, King George became focused on how to make the colonists respect his authority and obey him. That's what he becomes primarily focused on. One thing about rebellions is when you look at stage two, the problem is very fixable. But both sides, and then one in particular, really starts making decisions that makes the problem worse and not better. And when King George, here in stage two of our rebellion, starts to focus more on how can he get the Americans to obey his every command, and not how can he make sure Americans' rights are being protected, that's when things are going to start to get worse. We are definitely at the acceleration stage. Now, King George needed to get rid of the Stamp Act. He did not want to look weak in doing so, and that's what would have happened if he simply canceled the Stamp Act. If that's what he does, it makes it look like the Americans pushed and he backed down, and as a king, he could not allow that to happen. So he was kind of in a bind. He had to cancel the Stamp Act, but he couldn't do it in a way that made it look like the Americans were winning. So he and Parliament came up with a plan, and they passed what became known as the Declaratory Act, because it's just a statement, a declaration. And this statement did cancel the Stamp Act. But like it says up in the picture, it stated that in the future, any law that England's Parliament passed now must be obeyed by the American colonists. And that doesn't seem like it's so bad, because after all, when a government makes laws, we're supposed to follow it. But they're basically saying it doesn't matter what laws we make, and whether you have a voice in those laws and representation in Parliament, those things don't matter. We say you Americans do. And if you don't, well, there's probably going to be trouble. That was the Declaratory Act. And it's not a smart idea for three reasons. One, it didn't solve the problem. Yes, Americans are complaining about the Stamp Act, but the Stamp Act was just a symptom of the disease. The overall disease was the lack of representation that Americans had. And that wasn't fixed by the Declaratory Act. There were no voices given to the Americans in Parliament. So problem number one, the Declaratory Act, all it did was cancel the Stamp Act. It didn't solve the problem. And the second reason why it was dumb is that we know when England makes a statement like in the future you're going to obey us, they're going to pass laws. And the Americans will still have no voice. When that happens, Americans are going to protest. How do we know? Well, we already know that's what they do. They've protested numerous times before. You really don't think that just England saying stop is going to make them stop protesting. You know they're going to. And third, when that happens, King George is going to now have to respond with stronger action. He can't do a Declaratory Act Part 2 and say, all right, I'll cancel this act, but this time you'll obey, because it'll be an empty threat, an empty promise. When you draw a line in the sand and you basically say, don't cross that line or else, and someone crosses the line, there better be some sort of strong or else. And if there's not, people will realize that that threat means nothing and not take the threat seriously at all because it's just talk. King George doesn't want to be just talk. But when he makes a statement like this, and when he makes an act like this, he's simply setting himself up to have to use force in the future. Because as long as Americans don't have a voice in Parliament, and as long as England keeps making laws, especially tax laws, without Americans' voice, they're going to protest. And when they do the next time, England's going to have to respond with something more forceful. Well, that's what happens. For about a year, things were fine. Until this guy you see pictured, Charles Townshend, shows up, and he becomes the Treasury Director for Parliament. And he took over for a guy named George Grenville. Now, I never told you George Grenville's name before because we didn't really need to talk about his name that much, but he was the guy who was the Treasury Director before Townshend here, and he was the guy who made the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. Now, Townshend wants to get that debt paid off as soon as possible, and he starts making fun of Grenville. Those two guys hated each other, and he basically says, unlike Grenville, who failed because he was afraid of taxing the colonists, I'm not gutless like him. I dare to tax these colonists, and we will pay off that old French and Indian War debt. And he created an indirect tax, an import tax, like the Sugar Act. But it's got a complicated name. I mean, the name's not complicated, but they had to name it after him because it was a tax on several things. So the Townshend Acts were a tax collected when things came into America, things being glass, paper, lead, paint, and tea. These were all things that Americans either needed or were high demand because they wanted it very badly, like tea. And Townshend thought two things. Since this was an indirect tax being paid by the importers when they brought things into the country, Americans wouldn't notice. However, when you tax a lot of things and the price of lots of stuff goes up, people notice that. And secondly, he actually believed that since Americans had just been told a year ago with the Declaratory Act that they weren't allowed to protest, that Americans would obey the laws. He's delusional and was very, very wrong on both counts. There were massive protests to these Townshend Acts, and there were even bigger boycotts than there were over the hated Stamp Act. And this wasn't easy to do for the Daughters of Liberty to have these boycotts, to organize them and carry them out, because some of those products, like I said, were needs. It's really hard to kind of get them because England manufactured them and sold it to us. But they did it anyway, and they kept avoiding buying British products. And the Sons of Liberty step up their violence, taking their actions to an even higher level. They still weren't killing people, but they were doing things like tarring and feathering, assaulting people, vandalizing property, and going after people who were working as British officials who were collecting the tax, or even ones who supported them. They really had if you aren't with us, you're against us attitude. And they targeted people and wanted to strike fear into them so they wouldn't stand in the Sons of Liberty's way. And King George and Parliament were outraged by this. How can Americans in Boston continue to rebel when they were told they couldn't rebel by the Declaratory Act? They're breaking the law by protesting. Americans said, we have a valid right to protest. It's just our free speech here, after all, and we're protesting an injustice, an abuse that you, England, are doing to us when you don't give us a voice or representation in making the laws and taxes in Parliament. And as long as we don't have a voice, the colonists said, we feel absolutely correct and justified in continuing to protest. Give us a voice. We'll stop. But until that happens, we will definitely make our voices heard. Now, King George and Parliament now have had enough of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty and their protests. They're sick of their disrespect, as they would call it, and they said, again, you're not allowed to protest. This is illegal. The Declaratory Act mandates that you obey our laws. When Americans don't, he can't very well cancel the Townshend Act. So we talked about earlier, he would just look like what I call a paper tiger, somebody who talks tough or roars loudly, but there's nothing behind it as far as actual force. Well, King George needed to use actual force. And when the Townshend Acts are protested and boycotted, that's when he sends British troops to Boston. They are there to occupy the city and police the people. King George claims that the troops are needed to restore law and order and crack down on the violent actions taken by the Sons of Liberty. The thing about that is, it wasn't just that. Parliament passes what they called the Quartering Act, and that mandated that citizens of Boston, if they had spare bedrooms or spare living spaces, the British Army would force those people to allow British soldiers to live on their property. And you wouldn't have a say in this. People could be forced against their will to house these soldiers. And that takes away a variety of rights for people. I mean, if I own a house and a soldier's forced upon me to live there, it violates my property rights, my privacy rights, because I can't keep things private with a military guy, a police officer basically living in my house and snooping around. Also kind of violates my property, my privacy, and my free speech. Because how can I speak freely, especially if I support the rebels' actions with this soldier living with me? So there's more rights that are taken away. This is not just about taxes. The dispute between America and England, it's about rights, and the Quartering Act took away several. Now, the people of Boston were not friendly at all to these occupying soldiers. Now, the soldiers didn't want to be there. You have to kind of put yourself in their place. They're just regular guys, middle and lower class guys, who joined the Army because it was a good opportunity for them to make some money. It was a good job. But they didn't ask to be sent to America. They have no real complaint with the American people. They're not enemies. But they're sent there to do a job, to police a city that feels like their rights were violated. And when these soldiers get there, the soldiers now are the British Army. The Americans can't speak directly or protest directly to King George or Parliament because King George and Parliament are 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean. So they take out their frustration on the soldiers. These soldiers faced abuse, harassment all the time. They were mocked, spit on, harassed. The worst infuriating name they were called were lobster backs or bloody backs. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but they were mocking their uniforms. And if you mock a soldier's uniform, soldiers are usually pretty serious about their colors, their uniform, and everything it stands for. If a United States Marine came into the room and we started making fun of their uniform, I would bet he would be, or she would be, extremely upset. So back then, the British officers were the same way. They were outraged when the uniforms were being mocked. And this went on for months and months and months. Again, it wasn't personal for the people of Boston. They hated the soldiers, only because they really hated King George and Parliament. And since King George and Parliament were out of their reach, they took it out on the soldiers. The soldiers, who came into Boston with nothing against the citizens, start to hate the people of Boston because of the treatment they're receiving. And this goes on for months, and that hate builds up and builds up and builds up. And I like to call Boston, after a year and a half, a simmering cauldron of hate between the citizens and the soldiers. And there were people in Boston we call Tories, too, by the way, who sympathized with the soldiers, who didn't want conflict and didn't want things to get out of hand between the British and the American colonists. The Sons of Liberty targeted them too, to the point that many of these Tories ended up leaving Boston to avoid the harassment and abuse. Sometimes they moved as far away as Canada, as we think my family did. We did genealogy, my grandfather did, and he traced back our family tree, and there was a group of people living in Massachusetts right around 1660, 1670 or so. And then there was no record of them in 1680, but my grandfather found them living in Canada in the late 1700s. Sorry, I was talking 17. I should have said 1700s, not 1600s. 1770, 1780, he found them living in Canada. They fled the city. We don't know for sure, but it was probably because they were Tories, because that's why a lot of people left Boston during that time period. And again, I don't know for sure. They didn't leave notes or books or anything written down for us to tell, but that would be the most likely reason why folks would move to Canada from Boston right around 1770, 1774 or so. On March 5th, 1770, is a pivotal, hugely important event, the Boston Massacre. During that event, British soldiers fired into a crowd. And it becomes known as the Boston Massacre because, well, 5 are killed, several other Americans are wounded. And the Americans named it. They were the ones who kind of came up with a name. The The people of Boston believe what Paul Revere put together in this picture that you're looking at right now. People thought that that's how the Boston Massacre happened, that you had a group of soldiers that just shot for no reason an innocent crowd of men and women upon orders. You can see the captain there on the far right-hand side with his sword in the air, on orders from Captain Preston. And that these soldiers enjoyed it. Look at their faces. Some of them are actually grinning as they're firing into the crowd. That's what people believed, because Revere's picture got out there. The Americans already hated the British, and they weren't going to believe the hated British when the English soldiers said, hey, Revere's lying. This isn't what happened. See, what really happened in that situation, we saw in the John Adams movie. And if you're watching this outside of 2024, you likely haven't seen it yet, but you will. In that movie, The Boston Massacre, it shows what really happened. British officer was kind of harassed by an American. More Americans showed up. He may or may not have slapped one of the Americans, but when that crowd came, because the bells were ringing, that officer felt like he was in danger and called for backup. So the backup soldiers showed up, and they formed a semicircle, and that's when the crowd started to get really hostile. And they kept growing, too, because the bells were ringing, so more and more people showed up. And the crowd started to taunt the soldiers and then started throwing things at them. First snowballs, then oyster shells, ice chunks, rocks, even the clubs some of the guys had brought who were rope makers that they were throwing at the soldiers. And the soldiers, for a while, really didn't do much. They just kind of had to take it, as they had done so many times. But one soldier, as the testimony went from Captain Preston, was hit in the head with a club and knocked down. When he did, he dropped his musket, and the gun went off. And when that happened, either an order to fire was given, although Captain Preston swears he did not give the order. So the other thing that could have happened, too, was that the soldiers, hearing that shot, believed it came from one of the people in the crowd and opened fire at that point. And to make it worse, too, the people were yelling fire as well, kind of daring the British to fire. It was just a taunt. They didn't expect the British would actually shoot, because for a year and a half, the British just kind of stood there and took the abuse. So they didn't think they were in any danger. That's why they said it. But it was confusing for the British soldiers, because they're getting rocks thrown, sticks thrown, clubs thrown, shot goes off, guy got knocked down, people are shouting fire, and they did open fire on the crowd. When all was done, 5 were dead, several others were wounded. And Revere drew that picture to make it look really, really bad, even though Revere wasn't even there. But whether or not it was England's fault or not didn't matter. People of Boston blamed the British, and they really got mad when the British soldiers were put on trial for murder and found not guilty by a Massachusetts jury. That was probably the right call, because, again, murder means you intended to kill people, which didn't seem to be the case here. But Americans believed that they did, because they saw Paul Revere's picture and believed it was real. And when the soldiers didn't get punished, people in Boston thought those guys got away with murder, and they were outraged. King George and Parliament knew it, and they finally did something smart. They start taking away some of the taxes they would put on Boston, some of those Townsend tax. In fact, they took 4 of the 5 away. The tax on glass, on lead, on paper, and on paint. Those were all gone. The small tax on tea remained, and that's going to be important later. But they took 4 to 5 away, and they passed 0 new taxes on top of it. They just dropped some taxes. The idea was to hope the people of Massachusetts would start to cool down and over time forgive and forget what had happened with the Boston so-called massacre. But that didn't happen, because Americans in every colony, starting in Boston, formed what they called committees of correspondence. And what they did was create constant propaganda, letters, pictures, all of them painting the British in a very bad light. And they sent them to all of the colonies. And the goal was that Americans would never forget about the Boston Massacre and never forgive the British for it. And those committees were really, really effective in doing so. I know they were effective because of what happened 18 months later outside of Massachusetts. People in Rhode Island set this ship afire. The ship's called the Gaspé. And what happened to it was it just ran aground. A tide went out. They didn't know the water all that well, apparently. They kind of sailed up on ground. No big deal. It's happened numerous times before. And when in that situation, what you do These people come out, they bring ropes, and you kind of drag the ship a little bit till the tide comes up, then you can drag it right back in the sea. No problem. However, this time, the people who showed up did not bring ropes. They brought flammable material, and they lit the ship on fire and burned it. 18 months after the Boston Massacre, people had not forgiven and forgotten, and this wasn't even in Massachusetts. It was close. Rhode Island's a neighboring state, but it's clear that things are spreading. The anger wasn't cooling off. It was getting worse and spreading to other areas. England, though, doesn't realize this. They should have, but they didn't. They really felt that as time went on, Americans had cooled off and were forgiving and forgetting the Boston Massacre. The analogy I use here is one I always use. It's kind of like a campfire. If you have a campfire, and at night you go to bed and let it burn out, come back down in the morning and you look at that campfire, you'll just see the gray, smoldering ash of where the campfire was. To you, it might look like the campfire is out. But if you took a stick, started digging around in the ashes, you would notice there are some fiery coals there. That fire isn't totally out. If you were to take some gasoline and throw it on that fire, it would ignite really quickly. It's kind of the same thing here. England thinks the fire is out, but in reality, it's only burned down to coals. So if they do something else, like pass another tax, especially because Americans still don't have a voice in England's government and their parliament, Americans are not going to be happy about that, and they will respond and still be angry. And that's what happens next. The British do something awful, terrible, sinister even. They lower the price of tea so Americans are paying less for a product they all want. That's right, I said lower the price of tea. But they weren't doing this to be nice. There was a sinister motive here, something they were hoping Americans wouldn't see when they lowered that price. And that's what we'll talk about in Part 3, how lower tea prices cause big problems and how that will escalate into shots being fired and the first battles of what becomes the Revolutionary War being fought in Boston in 1775. That's coming up on the next video. Today we got through how England kind of backs themselves into a corner with their dumb declaratory act saying no one can protest. How when they did protest, because England still didn't give them a voice, they were then forced to send military that they put in people's houses. That really riled up the folks in Boston to the point the Boston Massacre took place, and England failed at trying to cool people off so that when they do come up with this Tea Act and lower prices, Americans will see the bad part right away and not be fooled. So we'll get to that one next time.